For decades, Dorian Yates kept it hidden. The pain, the obsession, the dark truth behind the shadow. To the world, he was a legend, carved out of granite. The man who stormed the Olympia stage 6 times and left his rivals in the dust. We saw the trophies, the blood, the sweat, and the unshakable image of a champion. But what we never saw, what we never truly understood, was the price. Now at 63, Dorian Yates is pulling back the curtain, revealing the truth that both destroyed him and defined him. This isn't just the story of a bodybuilder. It's a confession, the revelation we all suspected was waiting in the shadows. And tonight, we're diving deep into the life of the man who changed bodybuilding forever. Dorian Yates was born in 1962 in Solihull, England, a quiet suburb that seemed far removed from the noise of fame and muscle that would later define him. But his childhood was anything but steady. When he was just 13 years old, tragedy struck. His father died suddenly, leaving a wound that would shape the way Dorian saw the world. With no guiding hand, he drifted toward rebellion. The teenager who would one day be crowned Mr. Olympia was at that time falling into the shadows of gangs, mischief, and violence. It all came to a head during a riot in Birmingham. Dorian was arrested and thrown into a youth detention center. For most kids, that would have been the end of the story, a wasted life before it even began. But inside those walls, something unexpected happened. He stumbled across a set of weights, cold, unyielding iron. For the first time, he found something that demanded as much from him as he demanded from himself. Discipline replaced chaos. Focus replaced rage. What began in a detention center would become the foundation of his entire life. The all-or-nothing mindset that made him both feared and respected in bodybuilding was born here in the quiet solitude of punishment. It was the beginning of the shadow. By the late 1980s, the kid from Solihull was no longer just a troubled teenager. He was a force building in the dark. Dorian Yates stormed through the British Championships, his physique unlike anything England had ever seen. Dense, grainy muscle, carved from years of brutal training in the shadows of Temple Gym. That victory put him on the IFBB's radar, and soon the world would know his name. In 1991, he crossed the Atlantic to compete at the Night of Champions in New York. The bodybuilding world expected another rookie to get lost under the bright lights. Instead, Dorian shocked America. He didn't just show up, he announced himself. His size, his conditioning, his aura, it all screamed that the sport was about to change. By the following year at the 1992 Mr. Olympia, he proved it. Dorian Yates took the Sandow, defeating the reigning champion and beginning a reign that would last 6 straight years. But it wasn't just the wins that built his legend. It was the way he carried himself. Unlike Arnold, who thrived on charisma, or Ronnie, who celebrated strength with smiles, Dorian was something different. He didn't talk. He didn't show up at expos. He didn't give the media the satisfaction of a constant spotlight. He would disappear for months, vanish into Birmingham shadows, and then re-emerge only when it mattered, on the Olympia stage to dominate. That's how he became the Shadow, a myth as much as a man. Fans feared him, rivals respected him, and the bodybuilding world had never seen anything quite like him. The Shadow wasn't just a nickname, it was a strategy. While other champions smiled for magazine covers, signed autographs at expos, and courted the spotlight, Dorian Yates stayed hidden. He rarely gave interviews, he skipped the glitz of the bodybuilding circuit, and he avoided the endless parade of publicity that defined the sport in the 90s. Fans and competitors alike only saw him when it truly counted. On the Olympia stage under the brightest lights, with the Sandow on the line, that mystery became his weapon. By keeping himself out of view, he built an aura no one else could match. Rivals had no idea what he looked like until contest day, and by then it was too late. He stepped out from the darkness, granite hard, granite cold, and crushed anyone who stood beside him. His absence fed the fear, his silence fueled the legend, and in the end, the Shadow didn't just win shows, he rewrote what it meant to be a champion. Dorian Yates built his empire on a training philosophy that was as brutal as it was simple. High intensity, no compromise, every set to absolute failure. In Temple Gym, there were no mirrors of vanity, no applause, no easy days. Every rep was an assault, every workout a war. He called it blood and guts, and he lived it. The dungeon-like atmosphere became legendary, a place where few could survive, let alone thrive. Blood and guts. The phrase wasn't just a title, it was a manifesto. In the mid-1990s, Dorian Yates released a VHS tape that became bodybuilding gospel. Grainy footage shot inside the damp, dungeon-like walls of Temple Gym showed the world what his training really looked like. There were no fancy machines, no polished lighting, no background music. Just rusted plates, sweat-stained benches, and a man unleashing violence on the iron. The sessions were raw, almost uncomfortable to watch. One all-out set of leg presses left him trembling, veins bulging, as if his body might collapse under the weight. Spotters screamed, equipment groaned, and still he pushed until the muscles literally gave out. No posing, no polish, just pure brutality. For young lifters, it was a revelation. For the hardcore, it was a Bible. Generations of bodybuilders would point to blood and guts as their ignition spark. Ronnie Coleman carried that torch in Texas, training with the same relentless fury. Branch Warren took it into the modern era, with his own brand of gym violence. Even today, in dim basements and hardcore gyms around the world, Yates' shadow hangs over every barbell. His legacy wasn't just 6 Sandow's. It was the idea that true greatness is born where comfort ends and pain begins. But the price of that philosophy was steep. Year after year, the toll on his body grew heavier. Torn triceps, torn biceps, spinal issues that would linger for decades. Yet Yates pushed through the agony, refusing to show weakness. To the public, he was invincible, granite carved into human form. Behind closed doors, he was battling pain so intense most men would have quit long before. Every rep, every victory carried a hidden cost. The very training that made him champion was also tearing him apart. Piece by piece, his body was breaking, even as the world believed he was unbreakable. And for years, he kept the truth buried in silence, locked away behind the cold mask of the shadow. By 1997, Dorian Yates stood on the Olympia stage with 5 Sandow's already to his name. The shadow was chasing his 6th title, but this time his body was betraying him. Just weeks before the show, disaster struck. His left bicep tore, leaving his arm disfigured and his physique far from flawless. For most athletes, that injury would have been the end. But Dorian wasn't most athletes. He hid the damage, stepped onto the stage, and still managed to outmuscle every challenger in the lineup. The judges awarded him his 6th consecutive Sandow, cementing his place in history. But victory came at a cost he could no longer deny. Behind the cold mask of confidence, his body was crumbling. Torn muscles, chronic pain, years of pushing past human limits. It had all finally caught up to him. And so in the aftermath of his 6th triumph, Yates stunned the bodybuilding world with a sudden announcement. He was done. The shadow would vanish from the stage forever. Fans were left reeling. There had been no farewell tour, no warning, no chance to see their champion bow out on his own terms. One moment he was on top of the world, the next he was gone. The mystery only deepened. Why now? How broken was he really? And what would become of the man who had dominated the sport from the darkness? The shadow disappeared, leaving behind more questions than answers. For Dorian Yates, the battle was never just physical, it was psychological. For over a decade, his entire identity was built around one thing, being the shadow. Every meal, every rep, every breath was consumed by the mission to dominate the Olympia stage. But when the lights dimmed and the Sandows were locked away, he was left staring at a void. The sudden shift from being the most feared man in bodybuilding to simply being Dorian nearly broke him. Without the structure, without the war against the iron, he admitted he slipped into depression. For years, he had been defined by the chase, 6 straight victories, the aura of invincibility, the silence that fueled his myth. Now, there were no rivals to defeat, no stage to command, no reason to wake up and push his body past its limits. He confessed later that retirement felt like losing himself entirely. The armor was gone, the shadow had disappeared, and all that remained was a man grappling with questions he'd never allowed himself to ask. Who am I without bodybuilding? What is left when the obsession fades? For Yates, this was the hardest fight of all. The battle not against weights or rivals, but against his own mind. Dorian's relentless focus came with a price that extended far beyond the gym. Bodybuilding demanded everything from him: time, energy, emotion, and there was little left to give to anyone else. Friends drifted away, family ties strained, and personal relationships often buckled under the weight of his obsession. For Yates, the sport wasn't just a career, it was survival. Every choice was filtered through one question: will this make me Mr. Olympia? In that sense, bodybuilding was both his salvation and his prison. It gave him purpose, discipline, and a legacy that would outlive him. But it also locked him inside a cage of his own making. Social life, intimacy, even simple moments of connection were sacrificed on the altar of greatness. The shadow wasn't just a nickname, it was a reality. He lived in the dark, alone with the iron, cut off from the warmth of ordinary life. Years later, Yates would admit that his tunnel vision left scars that ran deeper than any torn muscle. The trophies were real, but so was the isolation. For all the glory of his 6 Sandows, there were nights when even victory felt hollow. Bodybuilding had given him everything, and yet in the process, it had taken just as much away. When Dorian Yates stepped away from the stage, the transformation was shocking. The man once known as the mass monster of bodybuilding, the shadow who dominated with granite slabs of muscle, slowly melted into someone almost unrecognizable. The 300-pound predator became lean, wiry, and athletic. Fans who saw him years later could hardly believe it was the same man who once ruled the Olympia stage. For most of his life, Dorian Yates was an iron disciple. His world measured in pounds lifted, sets completed, and Sandows won. But after retirement, the man who once lived in darkness began searching for something very different. That search led him far from the clang of metal plates and into realms most athletes never dare explore. Psychedelics became a turning point. Through ayahuasca ceremonies and powerful DMT experiences, Yates confronted parts of himself that had been buried beneath years of obsession and discipline. He described these journeys as revelations, visions that tore down the walls of ego and rebuilt his understanding of life, death, and purpose. Combined with yoga and meditation, they reshaped not only his body but his entire worldview. The result was a striking contrast. The monster who once pushed himself to the edge of human endurance now spoke like a seeker, a man chasing inner peace rather than outer perfection. Instead of worshiping pain, he preached balance. Instead of blood and guts, he sought mindfulness and healing. This shift didn't erase the shadow, it added depth to his story. Dorian Yates had lived two lives, one defined by iron and another by awakening. From there, he built a new identity, not as a competitor, but as a teacher and philosopher. He opened gyms, mentored young athletes, and used his story as both a warning and an inspiration. On stage, he had been a symbol of ruthless focus. Offstage, in his second life, he became something else entirely. A guide urging others not to repeat his mistakes, but to find their own version of strength without losing their soul. Dorian Yates didn't just win titles. He changed the standard of bodybuilding forever. Before Yates, champions were known for balance and beauty. The sweeping lines of Frank Zane, the charismatic mass of Arnold, the golden age blend of muscle and artistry. But when the Shadow stepped on stage in the 1990s, he brought something the world had never seen before. Dense, grainy, granite-hard muscle, paired with shredded conditioning that bordered on inhuman. From that moment on, the sport shifted. A new era began. One where size was no longer optional, it was mandatory. Yates raised the bar so high that even legends like Ronnie Coleman had to chase his blueprint. The mass monsters who came after Ronnie, Jay Cutler, Marcus Rule were all echoes of the standard Yates created. But his influence came with controversy. Some argue that he paved the way for the extremes that followed. The dangerous cycles, the escalating size wars, the physique so massive they strained the limits of health itself. In chasing the perfection Yates set, the sport itself was transformed, for better and for worse. His shadow didn't just loom over his rivals, it cast itself over the entire future of bodybuilding. Dorian Yates was never just about the 6 Sandows sitting on a shelf. While his rivals courted fame and endorsement deals, he quietly built something lasting behind the scenes. In Birmingham, he turned Temple Gym into more than a training facility. It was a fortress, a proving ground, and eventually a global brand. Hardcore lifters from around the world made the pilgrimage just to touch the iron where the Shadow had trained. As the years went on, Yates expanded his reach. He launched businesses, supplements, and eventually embraced the digital era with online coaching, mentoring athletes who wanted more than just muscle. They wanted the mindset that made him a legend. He transformed his experience into a system, teaching discipline, nutrition, and philosophy to a new generation. That's the part of his legacy often overlooked. The titles proved his dominance, but the blueprint he left behind is what endures. From his training principles to his business ventures, Yates showed that bodybuilding wasn't only about the stage, it was about building something permanent, something that outlasts even the strongest body. At 63, Dorian Yates no longer hides from the truth. For decades, fans speculated about what it really cost him to build the physique that redefined bodybuilding. Now he admits it openly. He pushed too far. The endless drive for perfection didn't just carve his muscles, it carved away at his health, his happiness, and the chance at a balanced life. The Shadow lived for legacy, but in doing so, he paid with a body riddled by injuries and a heart burdened with isolation. Yet even as he reveals the scars, he draws a line between regret and acceptance. Yates doesn't regret the discipline, the focus, or the iron will that made him champion. What he regrets are the extremes, the moments where he pushed past the point of return, ignoring pain, ignoring people, ignoring everything but the next rep. Bodybuilding gave him everything he dreamed of: glory, immortality, a name etched into history. But in the same breath, it took everything else away. His confession is stark. The price was broken relationships, a body left in ruins, and years of silent suffering hidden behind the cold mask of the Shadow. And what we all suspected, that greatness came at an unbearable cost, he finally admits. For Dorian Yates, the truth is no longer in the shadows. It's out in the open, raw and undeniable. Was it worth it? Would you trade your health, your peace of mind, even your closest relationships for eternal legend? That's the question Dorian Yates forces us to wrestle with. At 63, he admits the truth that fans whispered about for years, that greatness isn't free, and the cost is heavier than any weight he ever lifted. His 6 Sandows are undeniable proof of his dominance, but behind them lies a trail of sacrifice few could survive. The Shadow became a champion by giving every ounce of himself to the sport, and in the process, he lost pieces of himself that no trophy could ever replace. And yet, that's what makes his confession so powerful. It confirms what we all suspected, that to reach the very top, you must pay a price most would never dare. Dorian Yates reveals that greatness doesn't just demand strength, it demands sacrifice, suffering, and survival. And in the end, the question remains not for him, but for us. If you had the chance to live as a legend, knowing the cost, would you take it? Dorian Yates' legacy is written into the DNA of modern bodybuilding. He set the standard for mass monsters, dense granite muscle combined with shredded conditioning that every competitor after him was forced to chase. Without Yates, there would be no Ronnie Coleman, no Jay Cutler, no era of freak size that pushed the sport to its most extreme heights. The bar he raised in the 1990s became the foundation of everything that followed, but his influence goes beyond the stage. His blood and guts philosophy, train harder, train smarter, push to the absolute limit, still fuels hardcore bodybuilders around the world. In every basement gym, in every dungeon-like training hall, echoes of Dorian's iron war cry can still be felt. He showed what was possible when obsession met discipline, and the sport has never been the same. Yet Yates' greatest lesson isn't about muscle. It isn't about Sandows or size. It's about survival. True strength, he reminds us, isn't the body. It's what remains when the body breaks. It's the ability to fall, rebuild, and discover a life beyond the shadows. At 63, the shadow no longer hides. Dorian Yates reveals that greatness can define you, destroy you, and if you're brave enough, teach you how to live again.